We are full steam ahead. We are full steam ahead.
At the direction of the President, AUKUS is full steam ahead, as he said. And I know
when Richard Marles and Penny Wong stood beside their US counterparts in Washington at the end of last year, everyone sang from the same songbook.
Finally, as we move, as was mentioned, full steam ahead on AUKUS, we applaud Australia's upcoming delivery of an additional $1 billion to help expand US submarine production capacity.
And now this week's budget puts even more money into Australia's most expensive defence plan, funding the agency's workforce and infrastructure needed for nuclear-powered submarines. But the deal still relies on the US agreeing to sell them to Australia, and on a Trump administration that's already reviewed AUKUS through an America First lens. I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. Today, we're bringing you an episode where Ruby Jones speaks with former Director of War Studies for the Australian Army and adjunct professor at University of New South Wales, Dr. Albert Palazzo, on the US military's plans for expansion on Australian soil and what the secrecy around AUKUS is really hiding. It's Sunday, May 17. This episode originally aired in December 2025.
Albert, during this press conference, there was a lot of talk about AUKUS going full steam ahead, but not a lot of detail about what that actually looks like. So tell me what you gleaned from what we actually heard.
Well, they trotted out all the traditional remarks, including the ones that Australians and Americans have fought side by side in every major war since the First World War.
it is our only ally that has fought with us in every war over the last, certainly over the last 4 or 5 decades, and we're very grateful to them for that. And this is a very strong partnership.
Why that is relevant, nobody has ever said, but it certainly is used to indicate that we're closer than ever and closer than any two countries could ever be. But the last time I checked, Australia and the United States were different countries. And being different countries, you would expect us to have different interests.
And perhaps the most detail that we did get was from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence. So let's talk about what he said about how exactly the US and Australia are set to deepen their defence ties.
On the defence side, we're working on force posture, we're working on defence industrial cooperation. First on force posture initiatives, we're upgrading infrastructure on air bases in Queensland and the Northern Territory. That allows for additional US bomber rotations.
We already have a significant US presence on Australian territory. And now they're talking about bringing in more, basing Ospreys here so that the Marines could rapidly deploy on an offensive operation.
We're upgrading logistics and infrastructure in Darwin so more US Marines can do rotational deployments and pre-positioning MV-22 Ospreys. This establishes new and resilient logistics networks across Australia.
We've even had the US Air Force mounting attacks from Australian soil to foreign soil when they conducted that raid on the Houthi militants in Yemen, and they based out of Amberley Air Base.
America and the United Kingdom joining forces with Australia in tow to bomb Yemen. The Allies are targeting an Iran-backed militant group which has been launching attacks on international ships. Just minutes ago, the Houthis responded, saying the US and UK would pay a heavy price for the blatant aggression.
Now, I find this all very concerning because bit by bit, our government is allowing the United States to go to war from Australian soil as if it's not of any importance to us.
And Albert, earlier this year, the Pentagon ordered a review of AUKUS. That review was delayed. It still hasn't been publicly released, but some lawmakers in Australia and the US have actually seen it now. So what do we know about that review and what it says?
Well, we know very little because, the government has not released it, and there's no indications that the Minister for Defense will release it. But what he has said is that everything's great. It's all wonderful. We're powering ahead. Whatever AUKUS is meant to deliver, it's going to deliver it. And whatever it's going to cost, well, we don't know, but it'll be paid for. And everything's going to work out swimmingly well. And the United States is standing by us steadfastly as our most important ally.
It really was a very constructive, warm, frank meeting between the four of us, which took the alliance forward another year.
Now, they're continuing to believe that we're going to get these submarines. But as the U.S. Navy's Chief of Naval Operations has already pointed out, the U.S. build rate has not budged. They are not building enough submarines for their own needs. They're not maintaining enough submarines for their own needs. It has not shifted in the slightest. There's not been the slightest improvement in 4 years. And essentially, they have to double the build rate in order for Australia to get its submarines. There's just no way it's going to double. That's just an impossibility. And we're now scheduled, according to the Osman Dialogue, is scheduled to give them another $1 billion next year to put towards the U.S. submarine industry. That, frankly, is a drop in the bucket, although where our money is going is not ever explained. So the U.S. cannot build enough submarines. And if they can't build enough submarines, it would be madness on their part to give us a few.
Coming up, is Australia tagging along into nuclear war with China? So, Albert, at the same time as all of this has been happening, the Albanese government here in Australia has announced its own review mechanism. It's the AUKUS committee. So what is that in practice?
Well, the Albanese government, along with the opposition leader, Susan Lee, have decided to establish a AUKUS review committee within Parliament, and it'll consist of up to 7 parliamentarians and up to 6 outsiders. So we can fairly expect that anyone who gets this job will be fully committed to the AUKUS agenda. So this is not so much as a review committee as a rubber stamp committee. And it's also largely going to be held in secret, so the Australian public will never really find out what they're talking about.
And how concerned are you by that concept?
Well, I'm an Australian citizen, and I like to think that I have a right to know what the government is doing. And I'd like to think that in a strong, vibrant, democracy, the government can actually trust the people. Now, yes, there are certain things that'll need to be kept secret, such as, how many missiles it'll carry and what's its range and the exact parameters of its sensors and communications devices. Absolutely required secrecy. But most of it isn't secret. And most of it is things that we, as Australian citizens, have a right to know, such as who's going to control these submarines? Is it going to be controlled by the United States or by Australia? And if Australia decides to do something that the United States doesn't approve of, will the submarines still function? Or will there be a kill switch that will prevent them from doing stuff unless the United States agrees? Now, I think that's fairly important. And that should be confirmed to the Australian public. Now, the same way, are we planning to operate with these submarines in the East China Sea or in the Straits of Taiwan, in the face of potential Chinese opposition? Again, a fairly important thing to know. And I have, very little expectations that the government will tell us what their broader strategic planning is in the use of these platforms.
And so what do you think is behind that then, behind this amount of secrecy around AUKUS? Is this about national security, or do you see something else underpinning it?
There's an element of national security here which is legitimate, but that is, I fear, the minor element here. The larger element is that, the government doesn't want to trust the Australian public with this knowledge, because if they did, it's likely to be politicized by the opposition or by the Greens or by just, ordinary people like myself who will look at what the government is saying and point out where there are failures in logic or failures in strategic thinking or risks that they're posing to the country without telling the Australian public. So, the government wants to control the narrative, and the best way to control the narrative is to not let anybody in on what the narrative is. Politicians may, perhaps rightly or correctly, can be concerned about political risks, to their own, futures and their own ability to win elections. But I'm more interested in the national security risk. And we're heading down a pathway that can only lead to confrontation with China. And that's the full steam ahead. And if you looked at the national security strategy that the U.S. government published just a couple of days ago, it is heading towards a confrontation with China. And Australia is tagging along as a good little buddy, doing our best to help our long-established friend in a war with China. That is a risk of enormous magnitude because great powers cannot go to war. But our government seems to discount that as an outcome. And, the worst part of all is that both the United States and China are nuclear armed. And nuclear armed powers cannot go to war because if they do, everyone dies. And I'm saying that quite directly because that is the outcome of a nuclear war between great powers.
So, if AUKUS is this risky bet on an increasingly chaotic partner in the US, what is the alternative?
Well, there are alternatives. And one of the many areas of concern regarding the United States over the last, let's say, since the end of the Cold War, is that when there's a problem, governments have numerous levers in which they can solve the problem or try to solve the problem. But the U.S. has consistently, over the last 45 years, pulled the military lever. If they've got a problem in the world, their default response is to smash it. Diplomacy, talking, negotiating are no longer considered first-rank levers of government power. So what you should be doing with China is a lot of talking, and that's what Australia should be doing. There are international problems to which there is no military solution, and this is one of them. The U.S.-Chinese contest does not have a military solution because the military solution is enormously painful. So if there's no military solution, find a different government lever and start working that one. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. They're doubling down on the military one, and the Albanese government and the Australian military, the Australian Defence Force, are just happily tagging along for the ride. And this can only end in a very bad place.
Albert, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure to speak to you.
I'm Daniel James. Thanks for listening to 7am. We'll be back tomorrow with an episode on the politics of Eurovision and how Israel turned a song contest that claims to be above politics into a global soft power campaign.
People have known from the very start that Israel, in the last 2 or 3 years, has been manipulating the contest. They've been instrumentalizing it and using it as a vehicle for political soft power. And how they do that is that they put adverts on various social media saying, vote for our song, vote 20 times.
That'll be in your feed tomorrow. See you then.